Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, in our previous discourse we have discussed somewhat about postmodern fiction. So this is the continuation of that lecture. So in this lecture we are going to discuss the postmodern literature and its background, the notable influences of different scholars, its comparisons with modernist literature, and then we would discuss a shift to postmodernism. Students, the term postmodern literature is used to describe certain characteristics of post-World War II literature, relying heavily, for example, on fragmentation, paradox, questionable narrators, etc., and a reaction against Enlightenment ideas implicit in modernist literature. Students, postmodern literature or fiction, like postmodernism as a whole, is hard to define, and there is little agreement on the exact characteristics, scope, and importance of postmodern literature. However, unifying features often coincide with Jean-Francois Lyotard's concept of the meta-narrative and little narrative, Jacques Derrida's concept of play, and Jean Baudrillard's simulacrum. For example, instead of the modernist quest for meaning in a chaotic world, the postmodern author eschews, often playfully, the possibility of meaning, and the postmodern novel is often a parody of this quest. Students, this distrust of totalizing mechanisms extends even to the author and his own self-awareness. Thus, postmodern writers often celebrate chance over craft and employ metafiction to undermine the author's univocation, that is, the existence of narrative primacy within a text, the presence of a single all-powerful storytelling authority. The distinction between high and low culture is also attacked with the employment of pastiche, the combination of multiple cultural elements including subjects and genres not previously deemed fit for literature. Students, postmodernist writers often point to early novels and story collections as inspiration for their experiments with narrative and structure. Don Quixote, 1001 Arabian Nights, the Decameron, and Candide, among many others. In the English language, Lawrence Stern's 1759 novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, with its heavy emphasis on parody and narrative experimentations, is often cited as an early influence on postmodernism. There were many 19th century examples of attacks on Enlightenment concepts, parody, and playfulness in literature, including Lord Byron's satire, especially Don Juan Thomas Carlyle's Sartre resorters, Alfred Jarry's parodies, and his invention of pataphysics. Lewis Carroll's playful experiments with signification, the work of Ducasse, Arthur, Oscar Wilde, playwrights who worked in the late 19th century and in early 20th century, whose thought and work would serve as an influence on the aesthetic of postmodernism, include Swedish dramatist August Strindberg, the Italian author Luigi, and the German playwright and theorist Brecht. In the 1910s, artists associated with Dadaism celebrated chance, parody, playfulness, and attacked the central role of the artist. Tristan Tzara claimed in How to Make Dadaist Poem that to create a Dadaist poem, one had only to put random words in a hat and put them out one by one. Another way Dadaism influenced postmodern literature was in the development of collages using elements from advertisement or illustrations from popular novels. For example, Max Ernst. Postmodern artists associated with Surrealism, which developed from Dadaism, continued experimentations with chance and parody while celebrating the flow of the subconscious mind. André Breton, the founder of Surrealism, suggested that automatism and the description of dreams should play a greater role in the creation of literature. He used automatism to create his novel Nature and used photographs to replace description as a parody of the overly descriptive novelists he often criticized. Surrealists experiment with signification are used as example by Derrida and Michel Foucault. Foucault also uses examples from George Louis Bourges, an important direct influence on many post-modern fiction writers. He is occasionally listed as a post-modernist, although he started writing in the 1920s. The influence of his experiments with metafiction and magical realism was not fully realized in the Anglo-American world until the post-modern period. Students, both modern and postmodern literature represents a break from 19th century realism. In character development, both modern and postmodern literature explore subjectivism, turning from external reality to examine inner states of consciousness. In many cases, drawing on modernist examples in the stream of consciousness styles of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, or explorative poems like The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. In addition, both modern and postmodern literature explore fragmentariness in narrative and character construction. The Wasteland is often cited as a means of distinguishing modern and postmodern literature. The poem is fragmentary and implies pastiche like much postmodern literature. But the speaker in The Wasteland says, "These fragments I have showed against my ruins." Modernist literature sees fragmentation and extreme subjectivity as an existentialist crisis, Freudian internal conflict, a problem that must be solved, and the artist is often cited as the one to solve it. Postmodernists, however, often demonstrate that this chaos is insurmountable. The artist is important, and the only recourse against ruin is the play within the chaos. Playfulness is present in many modernist works, and they may seem very similar to postmodern works. But with postmodernism, playfulness becomes central, and the actual achievement of order and meaning becomes unlikely. Students, as with all stylistic eras, no definite dates exist from the rise and fall of postmodernism's popularity. 1941, the year in which Irish novelist James Joyce and English novelist Virginia Woolf both died, is sometimes used as a rough boundary for postmodernism's start. Its prefix post, however, does not necessarily imply a new era. Rather, it could also indicate a reaction against modernism in the wake of the Second World War, with its disrespect for human rights just confirmed in the Geneva Convention through the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Holocaust, the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, and Japanese-American internment. It could also imply a reaction to significant post-war events, the beginning of the Cold War, the civil rights movement in the United States, post-colonialism or post-colonial literature, and the rise of the personal computer. For example, cyberpunk fiction and hypertext fiction. Some further argue that the beginning of postmodern literature could be marked by significant publications or literary events. For example, some mark the beginning of postmodernism with the first publication of John Hawke's The Cannibal in 1949, the first performance of Waiting for Godot in 1953, the first publication of Hall in 1956, or of In Naked Lunch in 1959. For others, the beginning is marked by moments in critical theory. Derrida's Structure, Sign and Play lecture in 1966, or as late as Hassan's usage in the Dismemberment of Orpheus in 1971. Brian McHale details his main thesis on this shift, although many postmodern works have developed out of modernism. So modernism is characterized by an epistemological dominant, while postmodernism works are primarily concerned with questions of ontology. Okay, students, in your next class we are going to discuss some of the features of postmodern fiction writings, and after that we have some examples, and one of them is 100 Years of Solitude. But before that, you must have a simple understanding of postmodernism and how it is different from modernism. Okay, students, see you in next class.